Lee Allen Meyer says, not wishing to change the subject, but what is your take on student loan debt? Is it a problem now or will it be solved? Any solutions? And in fact, it's not actually changing the subject, is it? Because you just came out with a plan with some other economists. Tell us about that and student loan debt in general.
So we were approached. It's not really our plan, but we were approached by a couple that said, we're looking to fund some research. Do you think you could do a study for us? And the question that they were interested in was, at the time we started this research, it was $1.3 trillion in outstanding student loan debt. Today it's more like $1.4 trillion. So their question was, what would happen if we were able to just cancel it, right? Take it away, take it off the balance sheet so that people who currently owe this money don't owe it anymore. What would happen to the economy if we did that? And do you think you could answer that question? And I said, yeah, I think we could answer that question. And they said, well, a friend of ours is Mark Zandi over at Moody's, and he's agreed to let you all work with some of his team, and they'll let you do some runs on the Zandi model, which is a big macro model you can use to simulate, and say, you know, how would canceling the student debt affect the economy? What does that mean? It means a huge income effect, because all of that money that you currently take out your checkbook and write that check every month, now it's yours to do with in some other way. So what are you going to do with it? And then there's a wealth effect, and that's what we do in the paper. So we walk through the income and wealth effects, because if you tell someone you currently hold all this debt and now you don't have it anymore, then your balance sheet improves a lot. And so, you know, I think the results of the paper are kind of obvious. It's what most people would anticipate, that when you give people, you liberate them from this student debt, they can spend their money in all kinds of different ways, and you get a boost to the economy. It's not real surprising.
What are the downsides of canceling all the student loan debt?
Well, I guess it depends who you ask. Some people say it's not fair. It's not fair to the people who, you know, what if you just finished making your last payment yesterday?
That would suck.
And, and now there's a debt forgiveness. So we're hearing some, you know, it's interesting because this study came out yesterday, and it got a lot of attention yesterday and again today. And the attention's been overwhelmingly positive. 95% of the feedback that we've gotten has just been extremely positive. And those few people who've raised kind of questions about fairness or moral hazard, you know, the other thing is like, well, if you do this, then won't people just go out and take on tons of debt because they'll just expect that the government is going to come around and cancel it again for them or something like that. So, you know, we're hearing
but macroeconomic, the effects on the economy, no
so that's the really interesting thing. You know, if something bad were going to happen, then this would be ill-advised policy. So what would happen that would be a really negative thing? You know, it causes huge inflation in the economy. All of a sudden, you know, these people start spending into an economy, and there's not enough slack, and so prices start, you know, rising, accelerating, and you wouldn't want to do a policy if it was going to have that kind of macroeconomic effect. No, nothing like that happens in either of the models that we use to simulate the effects.
Linda Four says Congress uses MMT for its lobbyists and uses gold standard for us, the 99%. We came off gold standard in 1971. And so what was the gold standard, and why is it called MMT? What is modern about this monetary theory?
Well, let's do the first question, the gold standard. Why is it like a gold standard? Is that what you asked?
What was the gold standard?
So the gold standard.
And why does it matter?
Yeah, so the gold standard, it was a monetary system that was in place. We'll not get too deep into the weeds here with Bretton Woods and all that, but what she's referring to in 1971 was President Nixon's decision to untether the dollar. So there was a time when the value of the US dollar was tied to gold, which is, of course, a finite substance, right? It's a real thing. So when the US was on the gold standard, the government would promise to convert dollars on demand into gold. And what that does is it puts restrictions, it places a limit on the amount of money that you can safely spend into the economy if you're promising to convert any of the dollars anybody wants to return to you for gold, and you only have so much of it. And so the gold standard is a type of monetary system that places very real constraints on governments in terms of what they can do with their fiscal policy. We don't have that anymore. And you said, so what is MMT and why is it called that and what's modern about it? What she means is, in the modern era, when you're off of a gold standard and the rules of the game are different, when you have a pure fiat currency like the one we have today, it's not tethered to anything. The government doesn't promise to convert the dollar into gold or anything else. And that opens up policy space that wasn't available under the gold standard. So the rules of the game are different. It allows governments extra space to do things.
So to paraphrase Isaac Roger here, so can money just be printed at will by the government endlessly, or what are the limits
endlessly.
here?
Yeah, so that's the real trick. And MMT pays tremendous respect to the real constraints in the economy, because there are real constraints, and you can't print your way to prosperity. That's not a lesson that anybody should be drawing from the recognition that we're not on a gold standard. We have fiat money. Ipso facto, we can print our way to prosperity. Not so fast, right? Every economy has its own internal speed limit. There are constraints, and they're real, and they bind. And if you try to spend too much money into the economy, suppose you had the government say, we're not just going to do $1 trillion of infrastructure, we're going to do $2 trillion. And we don't want to wait around 5-10 years to fix all the crumbling roads and bridges and all this stuff. We want to fix it in 2 years. And on top of that, we want to do programs A, B, C, D, E, F, G, we want to do all this kind of stuff. You say, would that create a problem? Yes, of course it would create a problem.
And why is that? Because you don't have enough construction workers, you don't have enough concrete,
so,
you don't have...
Yeah, exactly. Right. So before you get, too excited about an ambitious infrastructure program, you would want to know, do we have the construction workers? Do we have the machines? Do we have steel, the concrete, the engineers, the architect? Do we have the real resources available? Or are we going to have to bid them away from current uses because they're not available, and the only way the government can hire them is to take them away from whoever's currently got them employed, and that would then, you would expect that would bid up prices.
So if the constraint is on the resources that are available, and the U.S. is kind of a service economy where it's heavily intellectually driven, would it stand to reason that the more you educate the population, the more resources are available to the economy, and then the fewer restraints there are on growing that economy?
When you say the more resources would be available through education.
So that there would be human resources.
Right.
Like, so now instead of having 500,000 engineers that could be hired, over time you've invested and you have 3 million engineers that are available. So do humans count, in other words, as resources
and this
here?
is one of the areas exactly where economists are pretty clear on what do you do to raise long-term productivity? What are the kinds of things, the investments that you can make today that would boost longer-term productivity and education and infrastructure and R&D? Those are the kinds of things, the investments that you would make that would raise future capacity to produce.
So you used to be chief economist at the Budget Committee, so you are quite familiar with how Congress deals with these issues. The Senate announced that it was going to be expanding CHIP. It's no longer going to be a 6-year extension, as it was earlier. It's going to be a 10-year extension. And the CBO had determined in its wisdom that a 10-year extension saves more money on the deficit than the 6-year. So Congress is using that money they saved and putting it over towards other healthcare programs and military spending and other ways to balance out their spending bill. Aren't they just kind of making things up there as well? Like, where is that money actually coming from?
Well, it's not even, where is it coming from? It's not even there. It's just a deficit that didn't get run, and therefore you can count it, in a sense, as a savings of a sort that then can be. So this is accounting gimmickry.
That's basically them deciding that we're going to spend money and we're not going to issue bonds for that money because of this reason. And they come up with some gobbledygook around extending CHIP from 6 to 10 years. But really, they could just say, look, we're not going to issue debt for this spending.
Well, they could. I mean, that's what...
They're spending money, and they're saying it won't create a deficit, so they don't have to sell debt against it. But they're
not sure.
but they're not raising taxes either.
I don't know that that's exactly what's going on. So with the chip, they're saying, had we done this, this is what would have happened. If we do this instead, this is what's going to happen. The difference is an addition to the deficit that doesn't take place. Not that there's no deficit, but that the addition to the deficit doesn't happen.
Well, right. There will be less deficit.
Yes.
Because the longer they authorize it, the more money it saves over the long run. So they kind of just pull that accounting gimmick forward, right?
Yes. Yes.
Which is the same thing as saying we're just not going to issue debt.
Well, we're not going to issue as much. We're not going to need to borrow as much as if we had done the shorter term extension, because it would have added more to the deficit. Yes.
Are there other instances where you've seen MMT be applied, like the principles of MMT applied in Congress, even though they don't use the language of it?
Sure. I mean, you had a question a little while ago about MMT for, I forget how she put the question, MMT for the lobbyists, right? So you often hear, even Democrats will say, we never worry about how to pay for things when we're voting, when there's defense spending or war. And we saw this just, right around the time of the end of 2017 with the defense legislation. The White House had requested money for defense, and there was a vote, and something like 80-some senators went in and not only voted to authorize the spending, but kicked in an extra $70 billion because why not?
Another $70 billion.
So,
right.
You asked for this number, but we're going to go ahead and give you this additional because why not? Because we can do that. And it's, as we started off saying, it's that authorization. When you said how does the government pay for things, that's how they paid for it. They stood there, they voted, and the spending gets authorized by Congress. And so do they understand this on some level? Yes, I think they do.